my latest research has been in the area of SARS, and it's a really interesting kind of a microcosm of how these infectious disease myths occur. Because it was such a short disease, but it was extremely well documented what happened. But throughout what was considered to be a epidemic of an incredibly infectious virus, nobody was asking the questions, and the two most important questions are, is it really infectious? Is it behaving like an infectious disease? And, are the treatments that we're giving, most of the time without even having concluded what the virus was, are these broad-spectrum treatments helping, or are we harming people? Those questions simply weren't asked, but there's enough that's been published in the scientific literature that you can say that it did not behave like an infectious disease, and that the doctors killed a lot of people through the use of novel drug regimens, a combination of drugs that had never been used before. And unfortunately, if something like this happens again, I'm afraid that they would take the same approach. There's almost a funny incident. SARS was supposed to be incredibly infectious, and not only was it supposedly a deadly virus, but it was almost like Superman, jumping tall buildings and flying at the speed of a bullet. You'd have, in one case, I think in Hong Kong, there was this suspicion that one man who got sick and died had touched an elevator button in a hotel that had infected a bunch of other people. So this was the most incredibly infectious virus.
Yes.
So a great experiment would be to put people who had SARS next to people who had AIDS. Of course, this would be completely unethical, but here you've got immune-suppressed people with AIDS, and people with SARS have this incredibly virulent infectious virus. Well, the Chinese did that experiment. They accidentally took a floor of a hospital in Guangdong, the center of the SARS epidemic, and they had about 100, I can't remember the exact numbers, but a large number of SARS patients on one side and a large number of AIDS patients on the other. And some of the AIDS patients were extremely immune suppressed.
Yes.
They had a corridor running down the middle, which the patients weren't allowed to use, but it had open windows on both sides. And at the end of the hospital at both ends, there were corridors that joined both wards, and the patients, both the SARS patients and the AIDS patients, if they were up and about, could mingle.
So that the disease would spread like wildfire, supposedly.
So it should have spread like wildfire, and the total number of AIDS patients who got SARS was, drum roll please, 0. Not a single AIDS patient got SARS, and the AIDS patients refused to wear masks. The SARS patients had to wear masks, although masks are not very effective at preventing this kind of thing because the virus is so small. But the AIDS patients, without any protection, didn't get SARS.
So what does that tell us? That SARS is not infectious, or?
Well, I think it tells us that SARS is not an infectious disease. Now, what do we know about respiratory diseases in places like Guangdong? Well, here you're talking about one of the most polluted places in the world. So if you have a few hundred people in a city of a few million who are coming down with respiratory diseases in the winter, does that surprise you? It doesn't surprise me.
Well, no, isn't it supposed to have started in the markets of China and the close proximity of farmer and animals?
Well, it's funny that it started in cities and it pretty much stuck to the cities. Like Guangdong and Beijing were the most affected, and both are extremely polluted. If it's contact with animals, you'd think that the rural areas would be, that people would come to a market, they'd come back, their whole village would come down with SARS. That's the kind of thing you would expect to see.
Yes.
They eventually concluded that this was due to the Chinese propensity to eat civet cats, which is definitely something I find abhorrent. But they looked at the people handling civet cats, and they found that about 70% of them had antibodies to this coronavirus that they had concluded was the cause of SARS. But not a single one of these people investigated was sick. And out of 1,500 cases of SARS in Guangdong, only 2 of them were people who handled animals. So this whole theory about animals being related to SARS is extremely tenuous. Again, if the animals had it, then how did the animals not give it to their handlers?
Yeah. And which animals were specifically supposed to be carrying this virus?
It's
Snakes
these wild
as well,
cats called civet cats, which are eaten, unfortunately, by Chinese in southern China, which is a part of the world where just about anything that moves gets eaten, including rats and snakes and scorpions.
Right, and so they're spattering blood and filth everywhere.
Yeah.
You would think that would be a very likely reservoir for virulent infectious organisms to breed.
Yeah, and they could say, for example, that, the animal dealers are immune because they've been around this virus for a long time, but then if this virus has been around for a long time, and if these people are infectious, how come the SARS epidemic didn't happen 100 years ago?
Yes, well, it's like AIDS, a sudden explosion of this supposed infection.
And another interesting thing that leads us into the question of the drugs that were used is that the death rate for SARS was highest in Canada, lowest in China, and intermediate in the other places that were affected, which are mostly Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, maybe one or two other Asian countries. So why would the death rate be lowest in China, which has definitely the most primitive medical treatment, and highest in Canada, which has the most sophisticated medical treatment? You might guess that it had something to do with the medical treatment.
It had nothing to do with reporting habits or anything, that the Chinese were hiding it?
Well, there was a certain element of that, but eventually the Chinese fell over themselves to show their openness, and they did reveal several thousand cases. But I think that what the problem was is that they decided to use a new drug for SARS. They had decided right off the bat, like literally the first day that word leaked out about SARS, they decided it was a virulent infectious pneumonia. So they decided to use a drug called ribavirin, which is an antiviral drug similar to AZT, which is used in AIDS. It's a nucleoside analog. It's being used not that much. It's used in hepatitis C, some other things like that. The problem is that ribavirin is extraordinarily toxic, and they were using extremely high doses, and in Canada, they were using intravenous ribavirin, whereas in China, it was just pills. And obviously, if you swallow a pill, you're gonna actually absorb only a fraction of the active compound. Much of it's going to get excreted, whereas if it's intravenous, it's going right into your bloodstream. And afterwards, there were many, studies that showed that the consequences of ribavirin, like serious anemia, and liver damage and bone damage, which are similar to the consequences from AIDS drugs. This is well documented in the literature, although most of the doctors don't seem to quite get the fact that they were actually killing their patients.
So what is SARS then? They did isolate the coronavirus. Isn't that a proper way of doing things? And then used epidemiological research and quarantine of people, and they defeated the disease. Isn't that more or less the method that they used? Well, that's the story. That one of the problems they found, there's a man in Winnipeg, I can't remember his name, he's a really top Canadian virologist, does a lot of research, a lot of consulting for the WHO, and the World Health Organization, things like that. He was noting that after it had been decided that it was a coronavirus, the percentage of people who were positive for the coronavirus kept dropping. So it was below 50% of Canadian cases were positive for the coronavirus. But the definition of SARS was extremely problematical. I mean, basically, the definition varied a little bit from country to country, but it had a maximum of I think, 3 components. And one of them was that you had to have a temperature of 38 degrees Celsius. Now, most people say, they had a fever. But 38 degrees Celsius is actually the lowest possible temperature which you could call a fever. This is not a high fever. And if you take a large number of people, you will find about 1% of those people who are healthy, who aren't sick, will have a temperature around 38 degrees Celsius. So if you screen
thousands and thousands of people, you're going to find people with a temperature of 38 who aren't sick or are just mildly sick. The second component was sometimes they insisted that you have a respiratory symptom, but that could be just something like a cough. So again, that's very vague. So a mild fever with a cough is hardly some new disease. But then the most important part of the definition was that you had to have had contact with somebody with SARS in the past 5, 10, 15 days, depending on the definition. So what that did is it made it appear like it was an infectious disease, because only if you'd had contact could you be diagnosed with SARS. So if you were, up on Inuvik and you had those symptoms and nobody with SARS had ever been in Inuvik, you could have identical symptoms and it wouldn't be SARS because you hadn't had contact with somebody with SARS in the last 10 or 15 days.
Yeah.
Whereas if you had been on a plane, from Hong Kong to Vancouver, and maybe there'd been a person on that plane who had got sick with SARS and you showed up with a bit of a respiratory, infection or something, you might be diagnosed with SARS. So it very much depended on, it was a very, very vague definition and emphasized the issue of contact. So it created the belief that it was highly infectious.
Uh-huh. My guest is David Crowe. He's one of the founders of the Alberta Green Party and is also founder of the Alberta Reappraising Age Society.